Hello and welcome to Philosophy with me. This is episode 2 and today we're talking about knowledge from perception. So this knowledge from perception topic kind of has two distinct questions. The first question is the metaphysical question. What is the nature of reality? So the question here is whether objects such as tables and chairs and roads and cars and so on, whether these things exist independently of our minds or whether they are mind dependent. In other words, if you and I and all the minds in the world were to just disappear, would things like tables and chairs and the road still exist? Then the second part of this is the epistemic part, and this is the question of how we connected to this reality. How do we perceive this reality? Do we perceive reality directly, or is there some sort of intermediary between reality and our perception of it? And so with these questions in mind, we're going to look at 3 different theories of perception today. We're going to look at direct realism, we're going to look at indirect realism, and we're going to look at idealism. So the first theory of perception we're going to be looking at today is direct realism. And direct realism is, as the name implies, a realist theory. In other words, direct realists believe that objects such as tables and chairs and the road exist independently of our minds, and if all the minds were to disappear, these objects would still exist. Then, on the epistemic question, direct realism says that what we perceive are these actual objects and their properties. So, for example, when you're looking at a chair, what you're perceiving is not some idea or some sense data. You're really perceiving the chair itself and its real-world properties. So, to put direct realism in more formal philosophical language, direct realism says that the immediate objects of perception are mind-independent objects and their properties. On the face of it, direct realism is kind of the obvious theory of perception. If I were to ask you, what are you looking at here? You'd presumably answer with something like a table, i.e. you'd describe the object itself. You wouldn't say something like brown rectangular sense data or the idea of a table. So direct realism is kind of the common sense theory of perception. The objects exist and it is these objects that we perceive. One slight hiccup for direct realism, though, is that we never actually perceive objects as they are because it takes time for light to bounce off the object and reach our eyes. For example, the sun is 149,000... No. For example, the sun is 149,600,000 kilometers away from Earth, and light travels at 299,792,458 meters per second. This means that it takes light 8 minutes to get from the sun to reach our eyes. So when you're looking at the sun, you're not seeing the sun directly as it is now, but instead you're seeing the sun as it was 8 minutes ago, because it takes 8 minutes for the light from the sun to reach our eyes. The moth is back. Let me get this moth. See, I hope you can see I caught this moth. I'm going to put it out the window there. Go on. Where were we? Oh yeah, time lag. To take a more extreme example, the stars we see in the night sky are trillions of miles away from Earth. Even the nearest star, Proxima Centauri, is more than 4 light years away from Earth, which means it takes more than 4 years for light from Proxima Centauri to reach Earth. Some of the stars we see in the night sky are so far away that it's possible that they don't even exist anymore, and yet we can still perceive them. So time lag is potentially an issue for direct realism because it shows there is a difference between our perception of reality and reality as it is now. The time lag argument is pretty easy for direct realism to respond to, though, when understood correctly. The fact that it takes time for light to reach our eyes doesn't prove that what we're perceiving isn't a mind-independent object. It doesn't follow from this that we're perceiving sense data, for example, or just ideas. All time lag shows is that what we're perceiving is an object as it was moments ago. And so the claim of direct realism still stands in this case. What we perceive are mind-independent objects and their properties. It's just mind-independent objects and their properties as they were moments ago. A bigger problem for direct realism, though, is the issue of perceptual variation. So perceptual variation is the way things look different to different people, or to the same person if they stand in different physical locations. And Bertrand Russell gives a bunch of examples of this in The Problems of Philosophy. And so one of his examples is the example of a table. So you think about a table, what are its properties? Well, it might be brown, smooth to touch, and rectangular in shape. But if you were to look at this table when a bright light is shining off the table, it might appear as though the table has a white spot on it. Then if you were to move to the other side of the room, this white spot would disappear. So in this example, your perception of the table has changed. One moment the table has a white spot on it, the next moment it doesn't have this white spot on it. Surely these can't both reflect the mind-independent reality of the table, and so at least one of these perceptions must be false. Or the shape of the table, for example. Let's say you are standing somehow directly above the table. Well, from your perspective, the table might look rectangular in shape. But if I'm standing at ground level, from my perspective, the table might appear kite-shaped. So again, it's the same table, but we have two completely different perceptions of it. So surely both these perceptions can't reflect mind-independent reality because the table can only have one shape. Either it's rectangular or it's kite-shaped. This is a big problem for direct realism because direct realism says that what we perceive are the mind-independent objects themselves and their properties. But how can this be the case if we have two completely different and contradictory perceptions of the same object? It's not possible that the table could be both diamond-shaped and rectangular, or could have a white spot on it and not have a white spot on it. And so this suggests that at least one of these perceptions does not reflect mind-independent reality. One way direct realism can respond to perceptual variation, though, is to introduce this idea of relational properties. So relational properties are still mind-independent properties of objects. They're just properties that objects have relative to other things. For example, England has the mind-independent property of being south of Iceland. But this mind-independent southness isn't an absolute property of England. It's relative to a perspective in Iceland. If you were to change your location to Spain, for example, then England is now north of you. England has the property of northness. But this doesn't show that England itself has changed. It's just that you, the perceiver, have moved, which changes what relational property of England you perceive. There's some sense in which England can have both the relational property of northness and the relational property of southness without having to say that England itself changes, because which of these two properties you perceive will depend on where you, the perceiver, are. Similarly, direct realism could say the table has both the relational property of looking kite-shaped and the relational property of looking rectangular relative to different perceivers. The table has both these properties simultaneously, and they're both mind-independent properties of the table, but which one you perceive, the looking rectangular or looking kite-shaped, is going to vary depending on where you, the perceiver, are. So this maintains the direct realist claim that what we perceive is the mind-independent table and its properties, without having to say either that the table itself changes or that the table somehow has two contradictory properties. So the next challenge for direct realism is the issue of illusions. So illusions are situations where your perception suggests one thing, but reality is something different. For example, I can't remember where this one comes from. It might be Descartes, or I think it might actually be Berkeley. But imagine you see a lighthouse in the distance, and from your perspective, from your perception, it might look square in appearance. But when you get up closer to it, you see it's actually round in appearance. So here, your perception was of a square building, and actually the reality was it was a round building. Or let me demonstrate an illusion to you right now. I have here a chopstick and a glass of water, and so if I angle this chopstick in the right way in the water, it may appear to look crooked. So your perception tells you that the chopstick is crooked, but we know that in reality, the chopstick is not crooked. So this is a big issue for direct realism, because direct realism says that what we perceive are mind-independent objects and their properties directly. But here, we perceive the chopstick as having the property of being crooked, but we know that in reality, the chopstick is not crooked. And so there's a difference between your perception of the chopstick and the reality of the chopstick. In other words, there's a difference between mind-independent reality and your perception. However, direct realism can potentially respond to illusions in a similar way to how it responded to perceptual variation earlier, with this idea of relational properties. So we could say the chopstick has the relational property of looking crooked when in water. And this relational property is still a mind-independent property of the chopstick, of course. So we're still perceiving reality directly. It's just that sometimes how an object is can be different from how the object will look from certain perspectives. And so, in other words, the chopstick isn't crooked in reality, but it does have the property of looking crooked from certain perspectives. And so when we perceive the chopstick as looking crooked, we're perceiving the relational property of looking crooked because we have this perspective. Okay, so maybe direct realism can explain illusions by wheeling out this concept of relational properties again. But what about full-blown hallucinations? For example, imagine you've taken a load of magic mushrooms, or you're suffering from a fever, and you look at your sofa, and in this altered state of mind, you see a goblin on the sofa. So there's clearly a massive disconnect between reality and your perception here. Your perception tells you there's a goblin, but of course, in reality, there's no goblins. So whatever you're perceiving, it cannot be mind-independent reality directly. In response to hallucinations, though, direct realism could potentially argue that hallucinations aren't perceptions at all. They're something completely different. They are perhaps imaginations. So if you think about dreams, for example, dreams aren't an issue for direct realism, even though the content of them doesn't reflect mind-independent reality at all, because dreams aren't perceptions at all. They are imaginations. And so direct realism could make a similar claim about hallucinations. Hallucinations aren't perceptions. They are something different entirely. And so just because in dreams and hallucinations our perceptions, or what we think we're perceiving, becomes disconnected from mind-independent reality, it doesn't follow that everything we perceive is just a hallucination or sense data or a mind-dependent idea. Instead, all it shows is that these are just weird exceptions to perception. And so direct realism can maintain its claim that under ordinary circumstances, all perceptions are of mind-independent objects and their properties. Our next theory of perception is indirect realism, and indirect realism agrees with direct realism on the existence of a mind-independent external world. It agrees on the realism part in the metaphysical debate. But where indirect realism differs from direct realism is the way we perceive this mind-independent reality. Whereas direct realism says we perceive mind-independent reality directly, indirect realism says we perceive mind-independent objects and their properties indirectly via mind-dependent sense data. Sense data is a mind-dependent representation of the physical world. It's not a physical object, it only exists in your mind while you're perceiving it. And so, if we were both to look at the same chair, we'd each experience our own private sense data, and this sense data would represent the mind-independent chair. If you were to look away, your sense data would disappear, but the chair would carry on existing. And so, to summarize indirect realism in fancy philosophical terminology, indirect realism says the immediate object of perception, i.e. what we perceive directly, is mind-dependent sense data, but this mind-dependent sense data is caused by and represents mind-independent objects. The motivations for indirect realism are often the issues with direct realism that we looked at previously, because we saw there's various instances where reality is one way and our perception is another way. For example, we saw how the chopstick could look crooked when in water, when in reality it wasn't crooked. So these differences between perception and mind-independent reality are easy for indirect realism to explain, because indirect realism can just say the difference is in the sense data. The mind-independent object, whether it be the chopstick or the table, is always the same. The reason our perception changes is because the sense data changes. However, the main issue with indirect realism we're going to talk about today is that it can't defend half the theory. It can't defend the realism part of indirect realism. Because if all we ever perceive is mind-dependent sense data and never mind-independent objects themselves, then how can we possibly know these mind-independent objects even exist? Look at the two diagrams here. From the perspective of the perceiver, what would be the difference in experience between these two situations? How could the perceiver tell when their sense data is caused by a mind-independent object and when it isn't? Surely there's no way at all. For all the perceiver knows, there could be no mind-independent object at all, and everything could just be sense data. Everything could be entirely mind-dependent, as idealism claims. The phrase veil of perception is often used to describe this problem, because there's a sort of a veil or a barrier between reality and our perception of reality, such that we can never actually experience the mind-independent objects themselves, only the sense data. We can never get past the sense data. And so, if indirect realism is true, there's no way it can justify the realism part of the theory. It can't justify a belief in the existence of mind-independent objects. Bertrand Russell defends indirect realism against this skeptical challenge. So, Russell accepts that we can't conclusively prove the existence of mind-independent objects, so he says we have to treat them as a hypothesis. However, he says, there's good reason to believe that the existence of mind-independent objects is the best hypothesis to explain our perceptions. Just as a bit of extra detail, Russell's argument here is an example of what's known as an abductive argument. So, an abductive argument doesn't intend to show that the conclusion is 100% definite, but it does aim to show that the conclusion is the best explanation of something. And so, even though Russell's response here doesn't prove with 100% certainty that mind-independent objects do exist, Russell argues that belief in the existence of mind-independent objects is reasonable and it can be justified as the best hypothesis. So, Russell's argument goes a bit like this. Let's say there's two hypotheses. Hypothesis 1 is that mind-independent objects do exist and they're what cause our sense data. Whereas hypothesis 2 says that mind-independent objects don't exist and all that exists is the sense data. Russell gives a couple of examples to do with a cat to illustrate why hypothesis 1, i.e. that objects exist independently of our minds, is the best explanation of our perception. So, imagine you're sitting in your lounge and you see your cat sitting on the sofa. And then, I'm paraphrasing a bit here, but you see your cat sitting on the sofa and you go into the kitchen or whatever and you make a cup of tea. Then when you come back into the lounge, you see your cat is on the floor. It's moved from the sofa to the floor. So let's test these two hypotheses as ways of explaining these perceptions. So if hypothesis 2 is correct and there's no such thing as mind-independent objects, and so the cat is just a figment of my imagination, it's just sense data, then I have for some reason a perception of the cat on the sofa, and then while I go to make my cup of tea in the kitchen, the cat no longer exists. And then I finish making my cup of tea, I come back into the lounge, and then the cat springs back into existence and it's on the floor for some reason. Whereas if hypothesis 1 is correct and mind-independent objects really do exist, i.e. the cat really does exist independently of my mind, then this hypothesis is a better explanation of my perceptions because, for one thing, it connects them. It explains why I see the cat on the sofa one moment and then why the cat is on the floor the next. So the explanation is that while I was away in the kitchen making a cup of tea, the cat still existed, and while I was making the cup of tea, it walked, travelling from point A to point B, from the sofa to the floor, such that when I come back into the lounge, I now perceive the cat on the floor. So hypothesis 1 seems to be a better explanation of our perceptions because it connects them. It provides a reason why I see the perceptions in the order that I do. Hypothesis 1, i.e. that the cat really does exist independently of my mind, also would explain why the cat gets hungry while I'm away. So again, I'm paraphrasing, but imagine you feed your cat in the morning and then you head off to work and you come back 8 hours later and the cat is hungry again. Well, if hypothesis 2 is correct and everything is just sense data, then why should the cat be any more hungry than when you saw it in the morning, given that presumably the cat didn't exist for 8 hours because you weren't perceiving it, it's just sense data. Whereas hypothesis 1, that the cat really does exist independently of my mind, explains why the cat would be more hungry 8 hours later even though I wasn't perceiving it. And again, the explanation is that while I was away at work, the cat still exists independently of my mind and it gets progressively more hungry throughout the day. So again, Russell says that hypothesis 1, the existence of mind-independent objects, is a better explanation of our perceptions because it connects them, it explains why we perceive them in the order that we do. John Locke, another philosopher who could potentially be characterised as an indirect realist, although the term didn't really exist in his day. But anyway, John Locke gives another argument that could potentially be used to respond to this sceptical veil of perception argument against the existence of mind-independent objects. So Locke argues that perception, unlike imagination, is involuntary. In other words, when you're perceiving something, you can't control what you perceive. So for example, when I look at this alien, I can't see anything other than the alien. I can't choose to see a frog, for example, or the number 7. And so what this shows is that perception must be caused by something outside of my mind, because if it was caused by my own mind, like in imagination, then I'd be able to control what I perceive. When I close my eyes, I can choose to see whatever I want. I can imagine a goblin in a jiu-jitsu match against an alien. But when I open my eyes, I can only see what's in front of me. So again, this suggests that perception, unlike imagination, must be caused by something outside of our minds. In other words, there must be mind-independent objects that cause our perceptions. Right, that I have to do. Locke bolsters the case for mind-independent objects further by giving some examples of how different senses can confirm the same object. So one of the examples Locke gives is how he can write something on a bit of paper. So I'm right. I write Christian on a bit of paper. So I can see the words with my eyes, and I could hand you the bit of paper and ask you to read what was on the bit of paper. And unless you were going to trick me, you would read the word Christian back to me. And so the noises I hear is going to confirm what I see with my eyes. My eyes see the word Christian and my ears hear the word Christian. So Locke would say the best explanation of the coherence of these different senses, the fact that different sensory experiences always accompany the same object, is best explained by the fact that this piece of paper and these words really do exist independently of my mind. This same object, this bit of paper with my name on it, causes both my visual perception and it causes the noises that I hear. So we've seen that indirect realism can potentially avoid this skeptical veil of perception argument, but George Berkeley, the idealist philosopher we're going to look at a bit more in a moment, raises a different argument against indirect realism. Berkeley questions the relationship between mind-dependent sense data and so-called mind-independent objects. Indirect realism might suggest that the sense data in some way resembles the mind-independent objects. This is what Locke says, for example. But Berkeley questions how the sense data could resemble the mind-independent object, given that sense data and mind-independent objects have completely different properties. They're completely different kinds of things. For example, sense data is constantly changing. When you look at a chair, for example, the sense data changes as you move, but the chair itself doesn't change. The chair itself is fixed and constant. And so Berkeley questions how mind-dependent sense data could be any way like mind-independent objects when they have completely different properties like this. Mind-independent objects and mind-dependent sense data would differ in other important aspects too. This isn't Berkeley's own example, but imagine how the indirect realist would account for your perception of the Eiffel Tower, for example. The Eiffel Tower itself, i.e. the mind-independent object, has the property of being 330 meters tall. Okay, but how could the sense data resemble this property? How could the sense data resemble being 330 meters tall when sense data isn't the kind of thing that can have any height at all? Again, this is another example where sense data appears to be a completely different kind of thing to the mind-independent object. And so this raises the question of how sense data could in any way resemble the mind-independent object, as indirect realism supposedly claims, when they're two completely different kinds of things with completely different properties. And indeed, indirect realism doesn't typically defend the claim that sense data resembles mind-independent objects, at least not nowadays. That's just what Locke says. Instead, a more modern understanding of indirect realism says that sense data represents, not resembles, mind-independent objects. One kind of thing can represent another kind of thing that's completely different. For example, a map of the Alps could be completely flat. It's just a piece of paper. But this map could represent peaks that are over 3,000 meters in height. And so the map can represent great heights, even though it doesn't resemble them. This 2D thing can represent a 3D thing. And so indirect realism could say a similar thing about sense data. The sense data represents mind-independent objects, even though it doesn't resemble them. So yes, sense data and mind-independent objects are two very different kinds of thing, but there is nevertheless a correspondence between the two, a correspondence between the sense data and the mind-independent objects that can maintain the plausibility of indirect realism. So far, both the theories we've looked at, direct realism and indirect realism, agree on the metaphysical question. They both agree on realism, that objects exist independently of our minds. But the next theory we're going to look at, idealism, is an anti-realist theory. It says that mind-independent objects don't exist and instead everything is mind-dependent. According to idealism, the immediate objects of perception are mind-dependent ideas, and there's no such thing as mind-independent objects. If something isn't being perceived, then according to idealism, it doesn't exist, or as Berkeley puts it, to be is to be perceived. In other words, in order for something to exist, it has to be being perceived. A bit like how the issues for direct realism could be used to support indirect realism, the issues for indirect realism can be used to support idealism. So for example, we saw how this veil of perception argument earlier questioned the indirect realist belief in mind-independent objects, and Berkeley makes a similar argument for idealism. But perhaps Berkeley's most famous argument for idealism is known as the master argument. Berkeley's book, Three Dialogues Between Hylas and Philonis, is, as the name would suggest, a dialogue between two characters. So Hylas is the realist philosopher, So Hylas believes that objects exist independently of our minds, whereas Philinus disagrees. He's the idealist. So Hylas believes that objects exist mind independently, and Philinus disagrees. And to prove his point, Philinus asks Hylas to imagine an object that is mind independent. So Hylas responds, "That's easy. I can imagine a tree that isn't being perceived by anybody." But Philinus points out that this tree isn't unperceived at all, because in thinking about it, Hylas is perceiving it himself. Philinus takes this to show that the very idea of a mind-independent object is inconceivable. It's a contradiction, like seeing something that's unseen. Conceiving of an object that is unconceived doesn't make sense as an idea, and so mind-independent objects are inconceivable. And Philinus, the idealist, takes this to show that mind-independent objects are therefore impossible and that idealism must be true. Despite being called the master argument, not many philosophers are convinced by Berkeley's key argument for idealism. As Bertrand Russell points out in The Problems of Philosophy again, Berkeley's master argument conflates the idea of a mind-independent object with a mind-independent object itself. To put it another way, it's obvious that a thought about a tree can't be mind-independent because thoughts are by their very nature mind-dependent. The fact that we can't conceive of a mind-independent object only shows that our thoughts are mind-dependent, not that the objects themselves must be mind-dependent. And so, perhaps the master argument is not the strongest argument against realism. A potential issue for idealism, though, is that it might lead to solipsism, the philosophical view that one's mind is the only thing that exists in the world. After all, if everything is mind-dependent according to Berkeley, and we should be sceptical about the existence of anything mind-independent, then what reason do we have to believe in the existence of anything outside of our minds or our perception? If to be is to be perceived, as Berkeley claims, then what reason do I have to believe this plant still exists when I'm not perceiving it? Or this chair? What reason do I have to believe that people still exist, or anything in the world still exists when I'm asleep? After all, everything is just ideas according to Berkeley, and if I'm not perceiving these ideas, then why should I believe they exist? This solipsism objection gives us an opportunity to flesh out Berkeley's theory in a bit more detail. So, yes, according to idealism, everything is mind-dependent. To be is to be perceived, and perception is reality. But if that's the case, what is causing these perceptions? If reality is just ideas and not objects, then what is causing these ideas? Berkeley considers three possible explanations of what's causing these perceptions, what's causing these ideas. Ideas themselves, his own mind, or another mind. Firstly, Berkeley rules out ideas themselves as the cause of his perceptions because ideas by themselves don't cause anything. Ideas are caused by minds. They don't just float around and cause things. Somebody has to create the ideas. So what about option 2? Perhaps Berkeley's perceptions are caused by his own mind. Well, Berkeley rules this option out too, for a similar reason to Locke's argument from the involuntary nature of perception that we looked at earlier. The one where you can't control what you perceive. When you open your eyes, you can't control your perceptions like you can in your imagination. And so, again, like Locke argued, imaginations may be caused by your own mind, but your perceptions can't be caused by your own mind because they're involuntary. So, Berkeley's ruled out mind-independent objects as the cause of his perceptions because of the master argument. And Berkeley ruled out ideas themselves as the cause of his perceptions because ideas themselves don't cause anything. And Berkeley also ruled out his own mind as the cause of his perceptions because if his own mind was the cause of his perceptions, then he'd be able to control what he perceives. So Berkeley says the only remaining option, the only remaining explanation of the cause of my perceptions must be another mind. And Berkeley says, given the variety, order, and manner of these perceptions, and that's a direct quote from Berkeley, Berkeley argues that this other mind that's causing his perceptions must be God. And so, according to Berkeley, The cause of our perceptions is God. All ideas, all so-called objects, are just ideas that exist in God's mind, and we perceive them when God wills us to perceive them. So, to bring this back to the solipsism objection, the objection that idealism leads to a skepticism about the existence of anything outside of one's own mind and the existence of this plant, for example, Berkeley would disagree with that. Firstly, Berkeley's taken himself to prove the existence of at least one other mind, God's mind. And Berkeley says, given that God is constantly perceiving what we'd ordinarily call material objects or physical objects, they still exist even when I'm not perceiving them. So when I close my eyes, even if nobody else is perceiving this plant, it still exists as an idea in God's mind, and that is just what objects are. And so idealism doesn't lead to solipsism, at least as far as Berkeley's concerned. And what's more, Berkeley's account here preserves the intuition that what we'd call objects continue to exist even when we're not perceiving them. And Berkeley does this by bringing in God. Again, God is constantly perceiving everything, even if nobody else is. But invoking God like this raises another potential issue for idealism. So, our perceptions often include sensations such as pain and uneasiness. And as Hylas points out, this contradicts the nature of God, because God himself isn't said to feel pain or any sensations. He's God, he's perfect. A related objection is that our perceptions constantly change, but God himself isn't said to change. So again, if all perceptions are just ideas that exist in God's mind, if all what we call objects are just ideas in God's mind, well, surely God changes because these ideas change. If I take a chair, for example, an idea in God's mind, and I chop the chair up and burn it for firewood, surely the idea in God's mind has changed, and so surely God himself has changed. So these examples appear to suggest a contradiction between Berkeley's theory that all our perceptions are ideas that exist in God's mind and the concept of God. How can our perceptions be constantly changing, or how could our perceptions include pain when God himself is unchanging and doesn't feel pain? So Berkeley has a response to this objection through the character of Philinus, and Philinus distinguishes between the way we, as human beings, directly experience and feel the ideas of pain and uneasiness, and the way these ideas of pain and uneasiness exist in God's understanding, but God doesn't necessarily experience them. So Berkeley argues that God doesn't receive his perceptions through his senses like we do. God is actively the creator of perceptions and the creator of ideas. So, of course, God understands and knows what these ideas are. God knows what pain and uneasiness are. But as the creator and controller of these ideas and perceptions, God doesn't have to experience them if he doesn't want to. As for the changing nature of perceptions contradicting God's unchanging nature, well, the explanation of this might be one for the metaphysics of God topic. I don't know if Berkeley himself says this, but it seems possible that perhaps God's eternal, i.e. outside of time nature, could allow that God experiences all ideas or understands all ideas and perceptions simultaneously. And so change from our perspective within time wouldn't be change from God's perspective outside of time, because God perceives all times and all ideas simultaneously. Anyway, Berkeley's explanation of this is that the nature of God is very different to our nature as human beings. So, according to Berkeley, all ideas, all perceptions exist within God's mind, within God's understanding, but this doesn't necessarily mean God himself directly experiences them if he doesn't want to. And so this explanation, this distinction between experiencing something and knowing what something is or having it in your understanding, kind of threads this needle and allows that all ideas can exist within God's mind, including change and pain, without saying that God himself feels pain or changes. One final objection we can make to Berkeley's idealism is the illusions and hallucinations objection that we made against direct realism earlier. So while direct realism massively disagrees with idealism on the metaphysical question, on the nature of mind-independent objects, direct realism and idealism are united in that they are both direct theories of perception. They both agree that we perceive reality directly. It's just that on the direct realist view, reality is mind-independent objects, and on the idealist view, reality is mind-dependent ideas. But if we're perceiving reality directly, as idealism claims, then how do we explain illusions and hallucinations? The classic case of the chopstick looking crooked in water. Well, if to be is to be perceived and perceptions are reality, as idealism claims, then Berkeley is surely committed to saying that the chopstick really is crooked. But this is obviously false. The chopstick may look crooked, but we don't want to say the chopstick really is crooked in reality. There's clearly a difference between our perception of reality and reality itself. Berkeley's response to the illusion problem is to just double down on the theory. He doesn't talk about a chopstick, but he talks about the oar of a boat looking crooked when in water, but it's exactly the same principle. So Berkeley says that the reason we consider the oar looking crooked in water as an illusion is that it misleads us about what we can expect from future perceptions. For example, if the oar looks crooked in water, then you might believe from that the oar would also feel crooked if you were to touch it with your hand. However, Berkeley says just because some perceptions that we call illusions mislead us in this way, they mislead us about what we can expect from future perceptions, it doesn't mean they are any less real than what we would call ordinary perceptions. So Berkeley just doubles down on the theory here. If something appears to be crooked, if you perceive something a certain way, then that is how reality is. As for hallucinations, Berkeley's response is similar to the direct realist explanation of hallucinations that we looked at earlier. Well, Berkeley actually talks about dreams, but it's the same principle. And Berkeley says that dreams are not perceptions, they are just imaginations. And so again, like direct realism, idealism could potentially draw a distinction between perceptions and imaginations and say that hallucinations are not perceptions at all. I suppose you could then ask Berkeley the skeptical question of why can't all our perceptions be dreams caused by our own mind? But I think this video has probably gone on long enough, so let's leave the discussion there. So to sum up, we looked at 3 different theories of perception today. The 2 realist theories we looked at, direct realism and indirect realism, agree on the metaphysical question. They agree that objects such as tables and chairs exist independently of our minds. They just disagree about the method through which we perceive them. When we went down the direct realism avenue, we are faced with a challenge about how we can explain situations where reality is one way and our perception of it is another way, suggesting we're not perceiving reality directly. For example, illusions, hallucinations, and perceptual variation. But when we went down the indirect realism avenue, while we were able to easily explain these differences between reality and our perception of it as differences in sense data, we are faced with a different problem, the problem of how we can justify this belief in mind-independent objects when all we perceive is mind-dependent sense data. So after looking at these 2 realist theories, we looked at an anti-realist theory. We looked at Berkeley's idealism, the belief that mind-independent objects don't exist, and instead everything we perceive, everything that exists, is mind-dependent. But this theory faced its own problems similar to direct realism, about how it can account for differences between our perception of reality and reality as it is, such as illusions and hallucinations. So as always with philosophy, it's hard to give a definitive answer about which theory of perception is correct. Each of these theories of perception has its advantages, and each of these theories has its disadvantages. So which theory of perception do you think is the most plausible? perhaps let me know in the comments. So there you go, another philosophy video in the books. Thank you so much again for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did want to research this topic in a bit more detail, I will link the page on my website that talks about theories of perception. It goes into a bit more detail, and it also covers a few arguments we didn't get a chance to cover today, such as Locke's distinction between primary and secondary qualities, as well as Berkeley's attack on this distinction. As for books, as always, you can get my book. It talks about this stuff in more detail. It's basically just a longer version of the website. And then the other books I mentioned in no particular order, Locke's essay concerning human understanding. Don't know if I'd really recommend it. It's kind of a long one and kind of boring, so sorry, Locke. But the other primary source I mentioned, Berkeley's 3 Dialogues, is again a bit of a page turner as far as philosophy books go. It's written in a dialogue format, very accessible, and also quite a short book, so you might enjoy that. And then the other primary source I mentioned is Russell's The Problems of Philosophy. Yeah, I can really recommend this book actually. As you might expect from the title, it covers a bunch of problems of philosophy, not just theories of perception. And again, it's written in quite a accessible, plain English style, so you might enjoy that. It's also not particularly long, so that one gets a thumbs up from me. And yeah, that about does it for this video. Thank you so much again for watching, and yeah, I will see you in the next one.